be repeating all of that. Cool. So yeah, today we have Vince coming to us, chatting about some dependency, not letting dependencies block you, blocking your development pipeline, and so on. Vince is a team lead at Entelect, and he's the mobile architect at Discovery. He's contracted out to Discovery, and he's here to talk to us. I'll let him tell us a bit more about himself. But just before we do that, we do have a sponsor for one of our key sponsors at the Developer User Group. They're called Process on Demand, so go check them out. Just yes, thank you very much to them for sponsoring us, for being one of our key sponsors. And yeah, obviously thank you to Entelect for sponsoring the Zoom room, as well as the venue, because there's some pizzas here and beers here. Yeah, just gonna plug that because you guys are all missing out. But yeah, that's pretty much all of that. So over to you, Vince. Take it away.
Cool, thanks, Josh. Yeah, thanks for that warm welcome, and welcome to everyone to DevUG. Yeah, name's Vince Reid, as Josh mentioned, team lead for Entelect, mobile architect for Vitality. And tonight's topic, which is very close to my heart, is don't let those dependency services, APIs, anything that kind of is important for your development pipeline kind of get blocked, essentially. So yeah, let's go into just a bit of the overview side of things. So I'll talk about a little bit about me, a little bit about the space I work in, which is Vitality, kind of speak to the problem scenario and kind of like, what's the headache there, and the, time losses and all those good things. We'll go into kind of like using process to alleviate the problem, because not everything needs to always be solved by technology. Obviously, as a software engineer, we want to jump into that route, but there is kind of things we can do from a process perspective. We'll go into the technology-based solution, how we're going to solve that, where to store your mocks, because mocks is quite an important key of the solution from a technology perspective. Different kind of good places to store the data, mock configurator. So we're going to go through end to end how we can solve this problem and kind of alleviate your delivery pipeline on a day-to-day basis. So just a little about me. I'm actually from Port Elizabeth, not from Cape Town. I'm not fully Cape Townian, but I've been around for a while now. Stayed at Nelson Mandela University, did a BSc Comp Sci Mathematical Statistics. So yes, I'm a bit of a computer nerd that way. Did that 2012, so you can do the math of how old I am. Everyone's reminding me I'm 30, so yeah, that ship has now officially sailed. I'm no longer the baby of the team. And then after that, I did my BSc Honors in Comp Sci, and then I kind of started my journey as a software engineer. Started off at a company called Solid Eye Tech. It was kind of a company based in ISP, automation, provisioning of your internet lines, managing your service providers, billing, all that kind of stuff. That's kind of like where my career started. And then back in 2018, I got this opportunity to join Entelect, which, nearly 5 years later, I'm still here. Joined as an intermediate software engineer, based on the nature of Entelect being a contracting house. I've been at Discovery Health at the time, just as a mobile dev, no prior development experience in terms of mobile apps before that. And then as time came on, Jan 2020, I became a senior software engineer, kind of earned my stripes, through several projects being delivered. And that's kind of where my career started changing from just developing to kind of mobile tech lead role, kind of bringing the architecture into the space, both for microservices and specifically for Android development. And then officially became a team lead because I have a passion for people and mentoring and kind of seeing people elevate their careers and their technical skill sets and also soft skill sets. And then this year officially kind of moved over in the client space to become a mobile architect for Vitality RSA. So kind of responsibilities there is managing the Android side, managing Flutter as we're going on this cross-platform journey, and then continuation of the mobile microservices and solutioning. So a little bit about the space that I work in. Like I said, Vitality RSA, we're very much working in a space where we are constantly in a perpetual motion of dependency services, dependency teams. So there's a lot of management thereof and a lot of integration points, and we'll get a bit more into that. But basically, we work in a world where we have microservices and we have a backend team that does all the backend stuff, or the persistence layer, and we kind of have to meet the two match the data and make sure that's all mapped correctly for the front end. We kind of deliver things in an architectural way that it's a one-to-one mapping for the front end. Now, why that's important to us is because we don't want to have to do app releases every time a business rule changes or some content changes or whatever the case is. So we do live in this world where we're taking data from a backend service, we're orchestrating it, we're mapping it using content management services, and we're providing data that's easy to use for the front end. So, the problem here obviously is because we're constantly dependent on the backend team for data, the permutations, the profiling, and all of that good stuff. It's so easy to get blocked by their services, especially when there's a new project of new endpoints and all that good stuff. So, something that's really important for us because of the dependency is that there is the correct data coming back. There is the correct permutations of different users and profiles and all that good stuff. Further than that, outside the requirement is uptime. If that service is down, it basically brings down all of the mobile app and that. So we constantly need their service to be operating, functional, responding correctly, and then ultimately performance, right? We work in a space where, if that service takes 30 seconds to respond, the developer experience, the testing experience, the BA experience all gets, is weakened. And we want to make sure that experience is as positive as possible, as effective as possible, so we can meet those all important deadlines at the end of the day. So let's go into the problem scenario, right? In my space, there's a few different things we need to consider. More often than not, we start projects at the same time as our dependency services, and this might be true in your specific space. Timing-wise, planning-wise, you have to kick off at the same time. So what we end up happening is, obviously, if you need to integrate with a service and you start off at the same time, you're not going to have anything to integrate with. So that's kind of where this problem really started to brew in my specific space, ultimately. And obviously, the other side of this coin is you might have services to be delivered by a specific date. You've planned your project, you're ready to integrate, but they could be late, right? That's normal. We're in software, we know things aren't always on time. And ultimately, that can cause your delay in your projects and your deadlines and all those good things. So there is an impact here on your delivery team when you are working with dependency services. And ultimately, your stakeholders will come to you and ask you, why is this late? Why have you not integrated? Why is the permutations not tested? Why haven't we done SIT, et cetera, et cetera? So you could be in a world where you're missing deadlines, not because of your own mistakes or poor planning or anything of that nature, but purely that you are blocked and you can't continue your development. So, we don't want to miss deadlines, and obviously we don't want to be over budget, incurring additional costs on a project that should have been simple, should have been a 3-week project or a 2-month project. So, these are the kind of things where you do have an impact, it's external, and now you probably have to manage expectations. And we all know that managing expectations comes with a lot of stress. Everyone's kind of pointing the finger at you, but ultimately it's not really your fault that you haven't been able to deliver because you have been blocked ultimately. So there is a, cause and effect relationship that's happening with those dependency services. So, yes, we want to do code and we want to do these clever solutions and architectures and all these wonderful things, but there's so much we can do just from a process perspective. We could really focus on having inception sprints, where we kind of create this collaborative mindset between your dependency teams, your external API providers, or whatever the case is. And you kind of speak to the requirement, you speak to the services you need, the permutations, the payloads, all those things. And when you start creating alignment, what's going to happen there is, number one, you're going to make sure you're solving the correct problems. But further than that, you'll make sure that you at least understand the problem domain in its entirety, which feeds into kind of the technology solution around mocking and all that, which obviously I'll get back to in a moment. But, planning, alignment, collaborating on solutions and services and all that's a very key part of at least understanding the size of the work, understanding, what you need to basically be able to integrate with that service. So like I mentioned, planning is key, but you also need to start setting milestones and key dates and all of those things. Without that, it becomes this endless cycle of waiting, and ultimately you want things to start getting delivered. And more importantly, you want to be able to hold your dependency contractors, third parties, backend teams, however you want to describe it, accountable to that. But it's one thing to set something in a line in the sand. Just like delegation, you can't just say, oh, go do this thing and walk away. You do need to be engaged. You do need to check in with that team, see how they're progressing so they can manage your expectations, which will enable you to manage your external stakeholder expectations. Because ultimately, when it comes to managing expectations, the earlier, the better. right? And if you don't have the right information, how can you manage your stakeholders? So that's also a key part here. It's not just the planning, but it's, keeping up to date, finding the progress, all those good things. And then something that we can do that isn't necessarily process related, it's just the way we schedule our project and plan our project, is to prioritize configuration work, all the boilerplate stuff, all the stuff that isn't really dependent on a different team. So in our world, we could build up your services, your CI pipelines, your new repos, all those kind of nitty-gritty things. And this will essentially buy you lead time. So the time and up until the point that the team can deliver that first endpoint or that first milestone in terms of your dependency services. So yeah, that's quite an important element. Another part of it, if you work in a world that's very front-end based, you could start building out your empty screens, some of your basic flows, your state management on your screen, maybe integration with your services. These, again, are all just little key steps we can do to buy ourselves lead time so we can actually do that integration of that dependency service. So process really does help us here. Proper planning helps us here. There's always something that essentially keeps the delivery train moving forward. So, there is a technical solution here. There is an approach. We do it in our unit testing pretty much all the time, which I hope we do have unit tests in our different services and all those good things. But we do use mocking, and mocking is a great tool for us to essentially get responses in a world where we don't have the real integration. We don't have the real data, the real backend, or whatever the case is. So you want to be able to set up mocks and that for every single endpoint in your system to drive your different screens or APIs or whatever the case is. But don't forget to always have the ability to switch it off. You want to be able to switch it on and off. Maybe you get the real service. Maybe the real service goes down for a day or two, and you want to continue the development, because just because you have the service doesn't mean you're not going to have issues after the fact, right? Maybe they didn't implement a rule correctly, and now it's by, kind of messing up all your testing and all that good stuff. So make sure you have the ability to switch on and off your mocking solution. And ultimately, you don't really want to be adding code for mocking and removing and doing that back and forth the whole time once the project's released or through the development lifecycle. So making these things configurable will give you a lot of flexibility in your day-to-day operations. So we know mocking is a good approach, right? We write in a unit test, we will stub a response and check that our mapping code is working and all this good stuff. But, there are some caveats or things to consider, especially when it comes to the payloads of our mocks, right? In our world, we typically work, with JSON services or REST-based services or SOAP payloads, right? And that's kind of, I would say, one of the key elements of using mocking is having payloads you can mock for. Most of the time, it will be JSON and SOAP and all those kind of things. But you make sure that however you write this mocking util that you want to deploy your services, that it can support all your different payload types. And that should be part of your architectural assessment and building out this util that can essentially enable your mocking. So more than just being able to return some payloads, you'll need to profile which mocks, right? You don't want to have only one mock for a given endpoint, because we work in a world where a given endpoint could have several permutations, several profile states, etc. So you want to be able to write your tool or your mocking solution in a way that it can cater for different types of users. So the same endpoint can respond different payloads for different user types. So something I'll keep nice and simple throughout this. You guys might have different mechanisms for profiling your data, different ways of managing permissions or checking if a user's in a certain cohort or whatever the case is. But for the sake of this, I'm going to keep it quite simple. We're just going to mock based on user IDs, right? It's something that's universal to any system ultimately. So you can mock different things, right? You can mock your microservice response or your service response, but you can also mock technically your backend responses, right? And the reason that's quite useful is because you are then able to do your integration development. Yes, it's not perfect. Yes, you can't sign off a project based on mocks, but especially when you're waiting and there's a bit of a delay and you already know your permutations, which I alluded to earlier, where you create a collaborative effort with your backend teams, it's important to understand all your permutations, set up your backend level mocks, in your code, it's serving this mocked object, and that will enable you to kind of map and orchestrate that data. So you kind of get 90% of the way there when it comes to delivering on your project. And that last 10% will come into verification, right? So that's when you actually have the service, You want to check that your data is returning everything as expected. So always in your plan, account for the fact that you need to come back and verify that your code is actually correct, because what would end up happening is you agreed on mocks and permutations of responses with your given dependency service. And lo and behold, they might change some things on that response, and now your code isn't ready for that. So always account for that in your planning. Account that you need to verify all those endpoints. You're just helping your delivery train. It's not a silver bullet. It's just another tool in our arsenal to ensure that we can continue delivery ultimately. So ultimately, your mock permutations. You want to mock the backend response. So you'll need to create a tool, right? And that's the part we're going to get to in a moment. So, yes, we want to write a tool to do our mocks, but we need to understand what mechanisms are available to us, right? Where do we actually physically store these mocks? So there's a few different options to use when it comes to technologies. You could use mocking with your database, where your table is just a simple, got some columns of keys and values where you can filter by a key. You can use a content management system, which is path-based. So the path defines which mock you're basically fetching. You can use a remote config service of sorts. A lot of us have remote config services, such in a Java world or a Spring world with, Spring config, a remote config, and all that good stuff. So again, that is still key value pairs. The premise is the same, but the technology that you're using can differ. So, you kind of have to ask yourself, well, what mechanisms do I even want to use ultimately? And I think the first question you ask yourself is, what technologies are available in your space? Each space have different places of where they could store data or get content or whatever the case is. So you do kind of want to ask yourself what's available in your given development space, whether it's, most of us have DB, so that's always going to be an option, but not all of us necessarily have content management services, not necessarily all of us have a remote config service or platform where you can change things dynamically. And then also the other question is really, really important is who actually maintains these mocks? Is it the developer's responsibility? Is it the QA's responsibility? Is it the BA's responsibility? And that will help you understand how technical you can be in terms of where you're storing your mocks versus the people that actually need to manage it, right? In my space specifically, we want to enable our BAs to be able to change mocks on the fly without needing developer input. Maybe business comes back, the content has changed. Why does the dev need to upload or change the content? A BA could do that, and then dev can do what they do best, which is coding ultimately. So usually in our world, when it comes to BAs managing mocks and content and all that good stuff, we kind of use a content management system, right? Where it's path-based. They just have to go update the file on that content management system, and Bob's their uncle. Obviously, the risk there is that, someone could make a mistake and break the mock and all that, but you know what? It's going to stop marshalling, and then you would have to just fix that content and just check in with your team. So communication is key when it comes to mocking, right? You don't want to just make changes and not let your team know, whatever the case is, because you could essentially push someone to do an unnecessary investigation, right? The whole point here is to keep the delivery pipeline going, not to stumble on something as basic as communication and making sure we're all aligned around what we're solving, what updates we're doing, and all that good stuff. So we'll start off with the tool, right? The tool is the real meat and potatoes ultimately when it comes to mocking, right? You could have all these approaches, you could store the data, but you obviously need a tool that can kind of decide, cool, based on this user ID in my example, which mock makes the most sense for that given user, right? So this is a tool you want to really write in a way that's generic. You want to be able to support your different mechanisms in your space for your different problem sets. And you write it once, you write it good, you write it solidly, and you don't have to keep coming back to it every time you need a mock on a new endpoint, right? There's always going to be some level of integration into this util, but you don't have to keep writing the mocking code over and over and over again. So that's something quite important. And you'll see on the bottom right, that I kind of have like a sample response in JSON of my mock configuration. So the mock configuration is quite important, right? It has a few pieces of detail that's quite key. It has the most obvious one, which is the is enabled, right? Is your mock on or off? So this is giving you an ability to switch mocks off and on without doing a code change, because nothing's worse than you want to change a mock and now you have to do some code changes, PR, go to the CR pipeline and redeploy. We want to alleviate all that additional overhead of process. So isn't able to give you that flexibility on a day-to-day basis. That's a hard stop on or a hard stop off to using mocking. More importantly is to have a mock key, because each of your different endpoints will probably have a different key for the different configurations. So that's your ability to fetch the correct configuration for the correct endpoint. Then quite simply, we have mock entries, which is all the different mock permutations. And each of those you would basically set up connected to your profiling mechanism. In my example, the mechanism is just a simple user ID. So my mock util, its function will say, cool, give me the mock entry for user ID X, and that will automatically resolve based on the different entries. So what that looks like in your space might change in terms of how you know what user is who, but the user ID is the most basic version of that. And what you'll see quite keenly here in the bottom right is naming your fields is quite important, right? You might want to write a util that could support all the different mocking mechanisms, the content management, the DB route, the remote config. So what we do have here is the ability that your mock will basically return an entry, and that entry will have those fields that will tell you which mechanism to use. So on a given endpoint, you could use all three if you want to. If you want to use just one, you can go with the one. I would always advise just sticking on a given endpoint to a single way of managing your mocks, else it becomes a bit too convoluted. But you might want on the one endpoint a content management based mock, but on another endpoint you might want a DB based mock. So that's just something to think about. But the util is kind of the driver of getting the correct permutation for your given user. So I'm going to go into kind of the mechanisms and how we store these mocks and what they look like, right? So the first mechanism is in database mocking, right? Nice and simple. Like I say, you create a simple database table. It has a key that you can filter by, which is your mock configuration permutation of interest, and the value is the payload. Again, the payload is whatever you want it to be. And the reason that's the case is so simple. You just make the value a string. Right, so you just take that string value, it's generic, and you can use that string value unmarshaled to a certain object of your choice, right? So I'll show you what this looks like in a diagram format, right? So we have a user. This user opens up their app or their website, or maybe consuming the API, depending on your needs, and some kind of service call is made, right? And that user's call happens, it goes to some kind of endpoint, whatever that endpoint looks like. And the endpoint goes, okay, cool, config util. So I'm just going to go with mock config util. And what it does is all that profiling, right? It's going to check for that user ID and it's going to return to you the relevant mock entry of interest. But this is on a configuration level. So we know which permutation to fetch, right? Once we got the permutation, whatever that might be, that's where your DB CRUD wrapper comes into play, right? Whatever technology that is, Java, C#, however you want to do, JPA for Java, whatever, right? But the point is you're going to take your DB mock config key, you're going to give it your CRUD wrapper, you're going to say, go look at your mock tables, which is nice because you're going to have one mock table that stores every kind of mock for your system. So you don't have to have multiple tables kind of making your system a bit noisier and so on for your DBAs. And it's going to take that, filter by the DB mock key that came from the config, remote config util, and ultimately it's going to give you a string, right? Nice and simple. And that string is going to be the payload in SOAP, in REST. And then ultimately what would happen at this point is your endpoint, your service, whatever that looks like, would take that string, unmarshal it to an object, whether the object is your microservice object, which sometimes can be easier. You don't want to deal with the integration code for now. You just want to get onto the front end. We'll take that object and send it back to your front end as a response payload. Ultimately, you can always unmarshal it to your backend object, and that's the power of that string value. It gives you a lot of flexibility. You got your profiling, you got your place for your payloads. How you consume it is absolutely up to you. So you have a lot of flexibility depending on your problem space, and then ultimately that mock response goes to the front end, and then you can dev all your front end permutations and ensure that delivery train keeps moving forward, right? There's a lot of pressure on us on a day-to-day basis. We have crazy deadlines. A business unit lets you know at the last second. You need to make progress. You can't wait for 3 months for a service. And through this mocking mechanism, you have the correct responses for your project. But what's quite important is that planning element, right? At the beginning of your project, when you're doing your inception sprint, having those conversations with the backend teams, understanding your different permutations, That's where key planning, yes, you did the configuration stuff, but that's where planning your front-end tickets, your back-end, your integration tickets are really, really key. So you know how those mocks play a role in that world. And again, let me not forget to remind you for the 15th millionth time, add time to verify your mocks. Don't think it's the be or end all. Business will want to sign off this feature based on mocks, and that you're playing a dangerous game when you want to go live and ultimately, take your feature live without any surprises or whatever the case is. So make sure you buffer your project plan with verification time. So that's a little about the DB-based approach. Like I said previously, the DB approach, your BAs or whatever, depending on who's responsible for updating these mocks, might not have necessarily the skill set or the access or whatever the case is to make those updates to those payloads. So the one that really works well, especially when it's not necessarily devs doing the updates to the mocks, is the content management system. And what will happen here is your kind of mock util will give you that content path, right? So the path is the permutation, but the content util, the config util or mock util is the one that's making the decision ultimately. So let's look again at a diagram. I think it kind of plays it out nicely. Very similar to the last one. The key difference is ultimately that where are we getting that payload from, right? So again, users viewing the screen, we're invoking a service. The service is asking the mock util, hey, which permutation is relevant to my user? And then ultimately we take that mock entry, but specifically the content management URL on that mock entry object, and we fire it off using a service wrapper. So obviously in this world, right, when we have a CMS system, you're going to have to write some service wrapper code, right? That service wrapper code is really important, right? That's the thing that's actually going to go fetch the content. So what you want to do there is when you're defining what that service layer looks like, you want that path to be configurable, right? Again, so that you're not doing the mocking code or fetching the mock code in different ways over and over and over again. You want to write it once, you want to pass in that variable as the path, and then ultimately you should be able to fetch that string JSON, that payload, that SOAP, whatever that looks like generically. And then once we do have that content or that payload for the content management system, Bob's your uncle, you unmarshal again to your object of choice, and you move forward. So this is quite nice because a lot of BAs or non-technical people are typically able to manage this without developer input. So yeah, this kind of alleviates that whole stress of having to manage mocks and dev and so on and so on. Cool. Then the final version of this in terms of where we're storing our mocks is the remote config. You could use Spring Cloud config, whatever works in your system, however you're fetching values from a config system using a key, and it gives you, some kind of string value or int or whatever the case is in your case. So the idea ultimately is still pretty much identical to the way you would have a DB and you're filtering by a key and getting a value and all that good stuff. But obviously where it's stored is just different from a database. So again, in terms of just a nice little service flow diagram, user views, we hit the service asks the mock config util for my user, give me the relevant permutation of interest. We take that, we use our config integration code. We say, please give me the value for config key X. And that again, strings again, I'm reminding everyone, is very important. So we can unmarshal to whatever object, and Bob's your uncle. So there's a lot of rinse and repeat, but ultimately you've got some options in terms of where you're storing these payloads based on the constraints of your space and your environment. Now, what I will say is this is fantastic, right? We have endpoints, we have screens, we can do mocks, we can do permutations, but something that really people tend to forget is that it's not a silver bullet, right? And the mistake that people make is making their mocks cohesive across a journey, right? So what I mean by that is on your first step in your journey, you serve a response, right? But on the second step, you might hit a different endpoint. And now you serve a different response because it has a different mock configuration. Now, the mistake people make is they might serve a response in the second step that makes no sense compared to what they got in the first step, right? So, maybe the first step told them they were a supplier, and then the second step that's fetching the costs, give you the costs of a company. It's not the same thing. It needs to be cohesive. So this is where during your inception sprints and your mock planning and all of that, you need to be very cognizant of what's the user journey, what endpoints are you consuming on each of those screens, and therefore start setting up your mocks. They start basically building out whole full-fledged journeys and keep that delivery train going. So This is something that I've seen a lot of people make mistakes on. Be cognizant, understand your journey, understand your endpoints, and start defining your mock configuration per user in a way that makes sense end to end for your journey. Obviously, you could have a journey that's 10 screens long. It means your mock planning will take a bit longer, but maybe you might need to be pragmatic. Maybe you only want to build the first 3 screens to build that lead time. So try and be pragmatic in your mock planning. You don't need to mock all 15 endpoints. Mock the ones in the beginning, allow your devs to do some integration code. If it's backend mocking, allow your devs to do some front-end code. And more than likely, by the time it's you've done your first few endpoints, your first few screens, your first few endpoints you needed from your backend teams, your dependency teams, your external providers, or whatever the case is, will start giving you those final endpoints, and therefore you can start doing verification and all that good stuff. And you've kind of bought yourself some breathing room. So this essentially ensures that you have the delivery train going. You make sure you're not doing too much, kind of just-in-time approach. And then ultimately, if you are 3 screens in, your devs are pumping, everything's in place, you still don't have your services that you need, manage your expectations with your stakeholders, and then again, reiterate on your permutations for your mocks and on all that code. So be cognizant of this bigger holistic picture. Don't think in isolation and think of mocks as a single thing. It needs to be cohesive ultimately. So yeah, this is quite an important item. So to summarize, when it comes to applying mocks, yes, we have the technology approach, and that's fantastic. We also have the process approach. So make sure you're doing your inceptions, aligning with your backend teams, understanding your permutations. Again, the permutations will enable you to set up your mocks appropriately, because more than likely, if you've created alignment, you already have the mocks on hand, you know what the payloads are going to look like, which will make that whole mock configuration exercise a little easier. You make sure to check in with those teams on the deadlines that were set. Beyond that, do your configuration code first, your services, build some empty screens, your states and all that good stuff. In the world of technology, make sure you build your mock util, considering what technologies you have available, who's going to manage that content. So, considering how much complexity is to update. And then ultimately you can use DBs to store your mocks. You can use configs, remote configs. You can use a content management system and kind of use the right solution for the right problem. The thing that I always advise to all my devs in my space in Vitality is there's no rule of thumbs, right? And everyone wants a rule of thumb, and step 1, step 2, step 3. Everything I've given you today is to help you make the correct choice for the correct problem, right? The correct technology, the correct place to store your mocks, the correct way to go about your process, right? But those things are tailored, right? Code is bespoke. Code changes, the requirement changes. So keep adjusting, keep being agile, and keep trying to solve it in the most pragmatic, easiest to achieve way, ultimately. And that's pretty much it to unblock your pipeline. This is something that I've really used in my space, in Vitality. Like I said, we're always starting projects at the same time as our backend teams. And because we've incorporated this into our projects, it's made it a lot easier. We can make progress. We're keeping stakeholders happy. And yeah, this is just a little bit of something that I've tried, and it's shown definitely positive results across multiple projects that I've run in the last few years. So yeah, that's pretty much it in a nutshell. Yeah, thanks. Or any questions? Cool. Josh, any questions on the chat? Yeah, go for it.
Just taking it back to that question of ownership after the fact. So your team is developing a service, you've reached out to other teams and you said, give us examples of your responses that they could expect from you. We'll generate the mocks. Could it be interesting to put it on its head and say those teams should provide a library of mock responses that you could draw on at any time?
For sure. I think that's, yes. Yeah, so obviously this the question is basically, in the suggestion I made that you kind of collaborate in the team and you're kind of suggesting what the permutations and mocks are. How about reversing that to the fact that, how do we achieve the team that you're integrating with, the service integrating, the external contractor or provider, whatever the case is, how do we negotiate with them having a library of mocks that we can use essentially? So I think it comes down to relationship and that initial conversation, right? And especially when you're working with the same providers, I know sometimes you work on different providers from time to time, but a lot of the time you are integrating with the same people, just different endpoints and different use cases. So there is a bit of a culture you need to start setting where you need to basically connect to their team and help them understand there's more to software than them just delivering an endpoint. They need to think about developer experience. They need to think about enabling the people they're integrating at the APIs, and it goes further into things like API documentation and all of that good stuff. So I think it becomes a conversation. And with any kind of conversation like that, there's always a cause and effect, right? So in that situation where I'm like, okay, this provider, I need this endpoint, but if it's not up or whatever, the effect is I'm delayed. So let's try and work on a way to get around that. And that's where the conversation of boarding mock libraries are into kind of their project solution or their project inception. And what will happen is when they start seeing that you're kind of bothering them less about all these little nitty-gritty details because you aligned earlier on, they might start incorporating that into their ways of working because they're already kind of preemptively knowing that people might start asking that question. So I think that's a matter of process, collaboration, and ultimately relationship building.
Thank you.
Cool, sweet. Yeah, go for it.
This is maybe diverging slightly from the topic.
Mm.
You mentioned verification, building that into your project buffer.
Mm-hmm.
Is that for automated verification, automated end-to-end testing? How does that fit with the mocking?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in theory, yeah, I mean, if you wrote your automated tests, right, with your mocks and all that in mind, I mean, when the real service starts coming in, your automated tests will definitely highlight if things are not as expected. So it's definitely a nice way to catch maybe discrepancies between what you discussed in the beginning versus what it is currently. Let's get real, not every single space has automated testing on that level, right? Which is automated integration testing at the real life service, right? We might have integration testing in our unit tests or whatever the case is, but not necessarily with the live service, right? So I think in an ideal world, yeah, that would be great. But most of the time, people are manually testing things after the fact. And this is where I kind of do enjoy front-end testing because a lot of the time, people don't necessarily understand fully how to test the APIs well enough, right? But when a UI isn't working as expected, it's pretty obvious. So I think it does depend case to case, but the reality is automated testing should pick it up because the responses that you add in your mock should be the promised responses you receive because that's the contract you have when you're negotiating what the payloads and permutations look like. But the reality is many spaces, many organizations, enterprise or smaller, just don't have automated testing. And it could not necessarily be someone's fault. It might be just the nature of the project. It's changing too often to have automated testing, right? Because you almost spend as much time deving versus preparing your automated tests. So yeah, I think it's a pragmatic balance between the two. But if you do have automated tests, you should be able to catch these kind of discrepancies between what you received and what you were promised. Yeah.
Cool.
Go for it, Marie.
You mentioned about factoring in time for verification of tests or mocking at the end. Do you have any advice for how much time to factor into that project? Or any...
So yeah, so basically the question was verification. How do you factor in the right amount of time for the project, right, or the integration or whatever the case is. So I think the best way to view it is we should always size things initially with testing in mind. So I think what's quite important is you should look at your permutations and then basically do some, math that's high level based on your experience, based on how long it would take to do different test cases, the aptitude of your QAs and all the relevant parts, and basically come up with the numbers essentially. So it is a combination of considering how many permutations you have, and ultimately the skill set of the team, the velocities and all that good stuff. So when it comes to me verifying, if I have 10 permutations without kind of actions or stuff, you can basically say, worst case scenario, 15 minutes per permutation or whatever the case is. I think it does depend on your space, but knowing how many items you need to cover should be part of your estimation in the first place when it comes to delivering the whole feature in a perfect world with integration all working the first time, and then basically add that to the end of your project. That's kind of the rough tabletop math we do. I don't think there's a perfect science when it comes to how much time you need, but ultimately looking at your original sizing, cutting out that now you can't do QA or BA verification, and then adding that bit onto the end of your project is kind of the methodology we'd use. Yeah, thanks, Mary. Good question.
I have a question. I'm unmuted myself here, so I'm sorry if there's double feedback, guys. But yeah, so how do you ensure that none of this reaches prod? Is that a concern? And then do you strip it out before you go to prod? Like, what is the mechanism there?
Gotcha.
Yeah, let's ask that for now.
Okay, cool. So the question, just for everyone's context online, is how do you ensure that you don't take mocks to prod, essentially, right? Do you remove the code? You know, what do you do essentially? So something that I find is quite important for your mock config util is, especially if you're using, you know, you should have your databases and your remote configs and even your content management systems separated between environments, right? You don't want your test content to end up in prod full stop, right? You don't want your database values and tests to end up in prod full stop, right? So when it comes to separating it out, when it comes to your configuration, right? So in your config util, you should already build in the fact that in wherever its data source is for the configuration, that if it doesn't exist, you assume the mock is off. So who's going to go and add a mock, physically go and add the configuration to prod? Probably no one, right? I don't really like the idea of removing the mock code, in my opinion. That's just what I find in my experience, because then you just end up playing this game of adding mocks, removing mocks, adding mocks, removing mocks. And I think as long as you have the idea that you have separate environments, you're managing it, you're communicating your team, all those kind of things, there's no reason for your mocks to be you know, false positively enabled into production. That's why that default case behavior is so important in terms of there's no configuration, there's no mocking. You could probably expand it even further and add like hard, like service level configurations to say mocks off in prod. Especially if you're profiling your service, such as in Spring, you can use your profiles, your prod versus test profile, and your prod profile, you might have a configuration injectable value that just says false, it's off. It doesn't even try to fetch the configuration. That's another layer of protection and can apply to all the endpoints. It's not configuration specific. So that's maybe a more robust, more generic way to ensure that you're not enabling prods, mocks in prod. Yeah, good question. Go for it.
I'm going to unmute here so that they can hear as well.
Okay, let me not double.
Cool. So my question is with regards to your pipeline. You were saying it's very important to build that relationship with your downstream or your upstream or your downstream, and to make sure that they are like aligned with you with what you need. But now what happens if they need to create those endpoints generic enough that it can be reused elsewhere and not tailored specifically to your use case? How do you consolidate that with this view of like building up that relationship? Is there some sort of give and take that you say they have to keep it as generic as possible and you're okay with that, you'll mock that out, or how do you continue that?
Yeah, I think like even in a world where things are generic, there still needs to be some form of contract of behavior, right? So at the end of the day, it can't be so generic in the case that you don't know how to handle that payload response. So there's always going to be a relationship between what the payload is going to look like and how you're going to map it. So I don't think you can get away with it. Even if your payload is hyper generic and can have the same object reference within itself, and you know, so on and so forth. Yes, that's totally possible. But when you doing these negotiations with these providers, I mean, this kind of ties into that previous question of having a library of mocks, right? A repository of mocks, and therefore they should basically communicate based on maybe the way the payload looks like for that generic record response in terms of when we're requesting for it. You know, there's still a contract of behavior. If I give you ABC, I expect DEF back, right? So no matter how generic an endpoint is, if you change things, you should always communicate with people that are consuming your service. You could have quite a big fallout if someone changes things on you and they don't let you know. So irrespective of how clever the solution is on a service, how generic it is, it can expand or contract or whatever the case is. The mechanisms is what's really important, right? The mechanism of behavior. So when you get that payload, there's probably a mechanism that tells you, hey, it's this, so you should map it in that way, right? So even in generic solutions, there's still mechanisms of behavior. And without that, you're kind of going too far down the generic track. So finding that pragmatic balance, even when you are the provider, is very, very important. And there's still always going to be some form of contract of behavior and expectation. Yeah. Sweet. Thanks, Josh. Any other questions from the public chat? Can't take him anyway.
Anything eye contact?
Eh? Ask people a question. Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I feel like I've repeated myself quite a bit. I guess I am keen to give away a prize to someone. So let me ask a question. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, go for it.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we
Can you can okay.
hold up. I think I can hear you, but I don't think the rest of the people can.
I can't hear it.
Okay, yeah, you can ask the question and then I'll repeat it.
Okay. Yeah, I heard you mentioned like a config being stored in like a DB as a string. So like what would be like the best way to like update it, like switching it on or off, because the query might be like a bit complicated if you know updating like a value there.
Yeah, that's a very good question. It does kind of give me a thought and a solution to that problem. So basically, you know, I kind of alluded to that not necessarily everyone has access to the database and can change the value directly on the database. What you can do is maybe start creating like a mock service, right? And that service is maybe wrapped by a nice, you could service documentation portal. So in Java world, like a nice Swagger interface, for example. And with that, you might be able to just hit a mock service endpoint where you give it the key and the value that you're looking to update it to. So that is something that you could do, which doesn't require you kind of opening up your DB client or SSHing into a server or anything of that sort. So that's where maybe you could kind of wrap your mock configuration in your test environment with a nice, easy to use service that's user-friendly, easy to view. And that might be another way where, let's say you don't have a content management service, you still want your BAs, for example, to update your content. So let's make their lives easier. So I think, you know, developer experience, delivery experience is very key part of that. And yeah, wrapping it with a service would definitely help alleviate that complexity of updating a database directly, where you're kind of trusting the service. It has a contract of behavior where you're passing in the key and the value, probably through some kind of post endpoint, and will update the corresponding value in the database. So that's definitely something you could possibly look at. Nice. Cool. But yeah, thanks for that question. Very good question. Sweet. Any other questions from the public audience? Cool. So I will be giving away some licenses. Krishecho is the only person who asked a question loud and proud on the online side. You getting a license, so I definitely feel like Oprah right now. 100%. Apparently, I can't give Josh a license because he definitely put me under the grill. I definitely feel like you know, everyone in the office asked actually pretty good questions. I will say, Matt, your question definitely was a solid. So I'd like to give you a license, dude. Yeah, well done, Drew. Yeah, check over here. And then, yeah, I think Maria's question definitely also put me a little on the spot, to be honest. It was like, you asked the question, but you kind of digged a little further. So Maria, I would like to give you a license as well, dude. Good job there. But yeah, guys, thanks a lot. Yeah, this was real fun to do my first Dev UG presentation. Great questions. I love questions to put me on the spot. But yeah, it was definitely fun presenting, and thanks for attending. Back to Josh.
Cool. Thanks, Vince. Yeah, so thank you everyone else for joining as well, because without the audience, we just have a guy standing in front of the pulpit speaking to the ether and the void, you know. So thanks, Vince, for being willing to do that in case no one showed. So, but thanks everyone for joining as well. We do have, as mentioned, those are JetBrains licenses prizes that were handed out. I do want, Katlecha, can you please just DM either me or Ezra your email address just so we can get that from you, and then we'll get the rest from the other people inside in the direct meetup. Yeah. Just another, again, a shout out to our sponsor, Tasks on Demand. Yeah, so thank you to them for sponsoring, and then again, obviously, thank you to Entelect for sponsoring the Zoom room, as well as the venue with the pizzas that we all are going to take home and eat, and you guys must be very jealous. Cool. Yeah, thanks everyone once again for joining, and then we will see you next month. Cool.